Hi YouTube, it's Kathy, and it's finally time to do the mid-year book freakout tag. Some of you started doing this at the beginning of June, and you're just wrong. If I'd been pressured in to do this at the beginning of June when everybody else started posting theirs, I would have 20 or so books that I hadn't already read that I wouldn't be able to pull data from, and that just seems wrong. I've done this tag the last couple of years. In 2018, I did feel pressure to do it a little bit early, so it was posted on June 20th while I was at VidCon in Anaheim. Last year, I posted it July 2nd so I could have all of my data, and I posted that one from Oromocto, New Brunswick because I was visiting family. And this year, I decided I would continue to stay strong and wait until I had all of the data for the first 6 months of the year so I could do this properly. It's my understanding that the questions for this tag change slightly every year, but I use the same questions every year so I can look back on those videos and get all of the same answers, if that makes any sense. The questions I'm using will be listed down below in case you haven't already done this tag because you were also waiting for it to actually be the mid-year. Also, if you did this tag early, it is completely fine. I'm just a stickler. I like to do things properly. If you're watching this video, I guess you're not too burnt out on this tag yet. The first prompt is the best book you've read so far in 2020. Because I'm a nerd and have a spreadsheet of everything I've read this year, which is a total of 118 books, I was able to go back and see what my favorite books of each month were so I could figure out what my favorite book would be, because obviously recency bias is a thing, so you're going to remember things you read more recently. However, while looking at my favorite books from every month, my favorite book from June is actually my favorite book of the entire year so far, and that's Felix Ever After by Case and Calendar. Before I read this book, I would be shocked to think that my favorite book of a month would be a Case and Calendar book because the other two books I had read by them previous to this were not my favorite. This book is about Felix Love, who is a 17-year-old black trans boy living in New York City. This talks about a lot of different intersections. This talks about family and relationships and grief and how we treat ourselves, and has to do with this character being outed and dead-named without dead-naming on the page, which was amazing. This book was absolutely wonderful. You need to pick it up. The next prompt is the best sequel you've read so far in 2020. It turns out I have read a bunch of sequels, which again, thank you so much to previous me for filling out the spreadsheet so I could actually go back and look at what was a sequel. Some of my favorites include the Murderbot Diaries books, Rick, which is a companion sequel if you will, but my answer to this question is Duke by Default. This is the second in the Reluctant Royal series by Alyssa Cole, and this is my favorite because it takes place in my favorite city, Edinburgh, Scotland, and has to do with a guy that owns an armory. I have a friend who owns an armory here in Canada. I also used to visit the sword shop all the time while I lived in Edinburgh. So I am 100% biased, but I don't care. I loved it. Number 3 is a new release that you haven't read yet, but you want to, and it's so many different books, but I've narrowed it down to 4 books just because I can. The first one is The House in the Cerulean Sea, which gives me introvert vibes. The second one is The Sound of Stars, which has road trips and music and queerness. The third one is listed as magical realism, which is not usually my genre, but it's A Song Below Water, which has to do with mermaids. And the cover is just stunning. And then I also really want to read Upright Women Wanted, which is a western about lesbian librarians. The next prompt is your most anticipated release for the second half of the year, and how dare you think that there's only one. If you've been here for a while, you know that I can't pick favorites. It's just not a thing I can do, so I've just picked 3 that I have access to that I want to read that are coming out in the second half of the year. The first one I'll actually be reading later this month because I'll be doing a buddy read with Audrey, and that's Phoenix Extravagant. This is written by Yoonha Lee, who is a trans-Korean author, and I am very excited because the only other thing I've read by this author I really enjoyed. I'm also looking forward to the year that Shakespeare ruined my life because I am a former theater kid, once a theater kid, always a theater kid, and I think that this one also has to do with being queer and coming out into the theater community, and I'm here for it. Another one I hope to read later this month is Anxious People by Frederick Bachman. This is a closed room murder mystery, and I'm very excited for it because I really like Frederick Bachman's writing. Number 5 is your biggest disappointment, and that has to be the Stonewall Riots, which you would think would be about the Stonewall Riots, but really wasn't. It was a very glazed over, mostly white, mostly gay, pseudo-history of the past 50 years or so that barely touched on the riots at all, to the point where it didn't even mention Marsha P. Johnson. The next prompt is biggest surprise, and this is open to interpretation, so I guess my biggest surprise was Gears for Queers, which I thought was going to be a fiction book, and was actually a narrative nonfiction book. I love narrative nonfiction books so much, so that was a surprise to me. I also just really enjoyed this book about this queer couple biking through Europe. The next prompt is new favorite author, and I couldn't just pick one, so I wanted to highlight a writing duo, which is Amy Rose Capetta and Corey McCarthy. Them writing together was new to me, and I really very much enjoyed it. I also wanted to talk about the absolute delight that is Aiden Thomas. He is just wonderful. If you're not following him on Twitter, you should. His debut book is also wonderful, Cemetery Boys. It's coming out in September. If you haven't pre-ordered it yet, you definitely should. And then the cover for his second book, which is actually the first book he sold, but is not his debut book, came out recently, and it is beautiful. Next we have newest fictional crush, and again, I couldn't just pick one. I don't usually have crushes on characters, especially because I read a lot of YA, and that would just be weird because I'm an old lady. However, I do have crushes on both Hades and Persephone in Lore Olympus. If you haven't read this webcomic, you really need to. Next we have new favorite character, and I had to think long and hard about this one, but I narrowed it down to two. One of them is Merlin in the Once and Future and Sword in the Stars duology. He's such an interesting character because in this story he is actually aging backwards, which is interesting. He's also queer and has to deal with whether or not he can have sexual relationships with people, because in his first cycle, obviously that wasn't cool, but now we're into the future and he's a teenager and he's got feelings, and I liked it a lot. Also, the titular character in The Faceless Old Woman Who Secretly Lives in Your Home is such an interesting character, and I really liked reading her backstory in this book. Next we have a book that made you cry, and again, I didn't want to narrow these down to just one, so I want to talk about Boy Queen by George Lester, which is coming out next month. I really enjoyed this book. It's about theater, it's about drag, I really like George as a person. I really identified with the theatrical performance aspect of this, and it made me want to get back on the stage. And then a book that made me cry because it was incredibly sad and just broke my heart was Weightless by Ian. This is a book of multiple poems that tell one story of this person who is raped at a party and what they do in the aftermath. It is incredibly heartbreaking. There's lots of misgendering, there's lots of just people being awful, obviously, and it made me cry a lot. It was also a fairly quick read because it's poetry. Next we have a book that made you happy, and here I want to highlight Heart and Soul by Erin Kinsella. This is about a woman who writes books, and one of the books she's written is actually being turned into a drama in Korea. She's Canadian, but one side of the family is from Korea, one side of the family is from Brazil, and she goes to Korea to see the TV show being made. And when she gets there, she realizes that the male lead of the TV show is actually being played by her K-pop bias. The series is full of queer characters. This book deals with a marriage convenience, and I am very excited to read the rest of the books as they come out. The next prompt is your favorite book to film adaptation that you saw this year, and I think I've only seen one, and it's weird because I actually read the book at the beginning of the year and then only saw the movie a week or so ago, and that's Howl's Moving Castle. The book and the movie are very, very separate things, but I think that this is the only adaptation that I've watched, so that is the answer. Next is the favorite video you've made so far this year. I want to highlight three recent ones that I've made. One was Queer Booktubers Recommend Queer Books, where I got a bunch of different queer booktubers to recommend books. I will link that down below. There are so many recs, there are so many people to check out if you're not already following their channels. I also really enjoyed making my Stop Following JK Turfling video, which is mostly about how to use Twitter lists. And the reason I really enjoyed making this small video is I made a video specifically for YouTube, but then I made a second version of the video with the closed captions embedded into it and put that directly on Twitter so that people who are using Twitter could see it and maybe stop following all of the problematic people that they're following and instead put them on lists so they can check up on them periodically. And a fan favorite seems to be my Fuckathon TBR because I used a fuck counter, which is something I stole from Zoe's All Booked. And by stole, I mean borrowed, because she let me use it, and I believe that she and Noria were both delighted by my use of it. The next prompt is the most beautiful book you've bought or received this year. I haven't purchased a lot of physical books. I know that there's a physical book coming to me from an author in the UK that hasn't gotten here yet, so I can't count that one, but one that I've recently purchased for myself but haven't had the chance to read is The Black Veins. Look at this cover. It's so pretty. I had the honor of interviewing this author as well as some other queer SFF authors during the Social Distance Book Fest, so I will link that down below as well. The last prompt is, what books do you need to read by the end of the year? All of them. I don't have specific books for this besides ones I've already mentioned that I haven't read so far. There are so many books that I need to read and I want to read all of them and I know that I can't, especially because I'm supposed to be reading fewer books this year, but obviously quarantine has put a little bit of a wrench in that. So technically, as long as I read fewer than 269 books this year, I will achieve the goal of reading fewer books this year. And I put that in place because my reading has been upping every year and it's going to get to a point where I just burn out and don't want to read anymore, which I don't want to get to because I love reading. So my cop-out answer is all of them. I just want to read all of them. If you haven't already done this tag because you were also waiting to do this tag for the mid-year point, consider yourself tagged. Have you read or are you excited for any of these books I've mentioned? Let me know about it down in the comments below. On the way down to the comments, if you hit that subscribe button, that would be very nice of you. If you don't feel like leaving a comment but want to make sure that I know you were here, just leave me an emoji or a smiley face if you're on your keyboard. Some of you have asked if there's a way to financially support me in this time, so there's a link to my Ko-fi account, as well as my link to my Amazon wishlist, as well as a link to my PayPal in case that's your speed. You can like and share this as you see fit, and I will see you very soon. Bye!